which is a disorder of motor planning and execution. And we know that apraxia results from damage to the frontal lobe in an area just in front of the motor cortex. And this is now known as the motor planning area. It is here, just in front of the motor cortex, that the plan for how to move a particular limb in order to achieve a particular goal is formulated. That plan then gets transferred to the motor cortex to be translated into a pattern of movement of very specific muscles. The best way to describe what can happen with damage to the motor planning area is to give you some examples that have been talked about in the literature. I'm going to talk about a case. It was actually one of the cases studied by a very famous Russian neurologist, Alexander Luria, L-U-R-I-A. Did a great deal of research earlier in the century, in the previous century, on patients who had suffered damage to the cortex to try and map the functions of different parts of the cortex. And Luria had a patient who, it turned out, had damage to the motor planning area and suffered from apraxia. Let me describe just one experience that Luria talked about with this particular patient to illustrate the characteristics of this disorder. This patient smoked. Luria was working with the patient. He offered the patient a cigarette. The patient was able to take the cigarette pack and take the cigarette out. He put the cigarette in his mouth. Everything's fine. Obviously, the patient could make all of these movements, including fine motor movements, required to do things like smoking. Then Luria handed the patient a box of wooden matches, those big match, the old kind of big wooden matches. The patient was able to open the box, take a wooden match out, struck the match on the side of the box. Again, notice, all of the movement capabilities are there. And the patient knows what he wants to do. He lit the match, and obviously he could see it was lit, and he knew it was lit. But at that point, instead of moving the match to the cigarette, he continued to strike this already lit match against the side of the matchbox. So the motor plan had been formed to some degree and started to be carried out, but at some point, something went wrong. In between the more general goal of what he wanted to do and the translation of that goal into a specific plan to be given to the neurons in the motor cortex. And this is very common with patients with apraxia, is that they get started doing things and then they get hung up on one step and they do that step over and over and over again and don't move on to the next step in the plan. So something's going wrong between the more general global goal of what you want to do and the translation of that goal into a plan to be given to the neurons in the motor cortex. At that point, to prevent the poor patient from burning himself, Luria knocked the match out of his hand as it was burning down. The patient knew something was wrong, but he couldn't stop the action. At that point, Luria handed him the box of matches again, and the patient took the matches out, lit another match, and this time he didn't persist in that action. This time, he moved the match not to the cigarette, but to his mouth. And he hurt himself a little bit, but Luria again knocked it out of his hand just before he hurt himself too much. And again, you can see here, now this wasn't a case of having done something correctly, but then doing it again and again. This was the case of doing something related to what he wanted to do, but not quite exactly what he wanted to do. And again, this happens in cases of damage to the motor planning area. You can see where the patient does something that has some relationship to the goal, but it's not the right action. And the patient knows it's not the right action. But at that moment, the patient is incapable of forming the motor plan for the actually correct action. Apraxia, disorder of motor planning and execution.